From time to time in history men are born a whole age too soon. Probably the men were so great, so self-fed, that recognition of them by others was not necessary to them. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Jung was one of the most acute men who ever lived, but had the misfortune to be too far in advance of his contemporaries. They looked on him with astonishment, but could not follow his bold speculations, and thus a mass of his important thoughts remained buried and forgotten in the transactions of the Royal Society, until a later generation by slow degrees arrived at the rediscovery of his discoveries and came to appreciate the force of his arguments and the accuracy of his conclusions. Hermann von Helmholtz. The English polymath Thomas Young helped decipher the Rosetta Stone, unlock the secrets of vision and color perception, and laid the foundations for the wave theory of light. As a medical doctor, prolific contributor to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and a member of the Royal Society, he published numerous papers on a dizzying array of subjects. Young Helmholtz theory, Young's temperament, Young's modulus, and the Young-Laplace equation are all testaments to the breadth of his interests and his lasting influence on our world. Thomas Young was born in Somersetshire, England, on the 13th of June, 1773. His aptitudes, combined with his discipline and curiosity, made him a model pupil and a stupendous autodidact. He learned to read at age 2. By age 6 he had read twice through the Bible and had begun learning Latin. Between 1780 and 1786 he attended 2 boarding schools, where he learned Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. He began studying sciences by himself. Needing instruments for his research, he learned how to construct telescopes and microscopes. Reflecting on his character, psychologist Colin Martindale writes, Young exemplifies the traits one finds in a genius of the first order: a tendency toward analogical thinking, high intelligence, an amazing capacity for hard work, extremely wide interests, distaste for traditional dogmas, and very high self-esteem. Since his death he has won the praise of figures as eminent as Einstein and James Clerk Maxwell. However, accusations of dilettantism persist. A modern historian of science writes, "He was certainly highly intelligent, but he appears to have lacked the discipline and insight necessary to pursue topics in great depth. He was most comfortable writing on subjects where he could organize the views of others in original ways." Some of these qualities, perhaps, are attributable to his upbringing. Francis Galton found him an unsuitable subject for his book on hereditary genius, for, besides one great uncle, Richard Brocklesby, Young's ancestry was not illustrious. Thomas's father, a banker and merchant, and his mother, daughter of a wealthy trader, were hardly derelicts. Yet they did not display the intellectual prowess that would earn their son the epithet phenomenon. His parents, unlike those of child prodigies John Stuart Mill and William James Sidus, did not wish to show off their son's talents. Nor did they, unlike the parents of countless forgotten phenomena, pressure him to study. Unlike fellow polymath Robert Hooke, Young was an amicable and sociable man who enjoyed dancing, singing, playing the flute, and horseback riding. As Isaac Asimov remarked, he was the best kind of infant prodigy, the kind that matures into an adult prodigy. Although there is scant mention of them in his autobiographical sketch, a piece in which he refers to himself in the third person, his parents and their Quaker faith undoubtedly had an impact upon him. A minority sect, Quakers were disproportionately represented in many professions, including medicine. The physician Thomas Dimsdale, a friend of the Young family, botanist James Backhouse, and chemist John Dalton were among the great Quaker scientists of the 19th century. The physician Richard Brocklesby, a Fellow of the Royal Society, was another. Predictably, the boarding schools he attended were not the right pace for him. At one near Bristol, which he described as miserable, he found he had finished the mathematics textbook before the class was halfway done. At 9 he transferred to a school in Dorsetshire, where he was given more freedom to work independently. At 13, he graduated from primary school. Shortly thereafter, he became infatuated with Hebrew. At 14, he was familiar with 13 disparate languages, living and dead. It was around this time Thomas, outfitted in quaint Quaker clothing, visited a bookstore and began perusing an expensive volume written in Greek or Latin. The seller, amused by the boy, told him he could have it if he translated one page into English. Jung performed the task quickly and skillfully. Bewildered, the shopkeep kept his promise and unhappily parted with the tome. From 1787 to 1792, Thomas lived with David Barclay to help tutor his grandson, Hudson Gurney. Although different in many ways, the two remained lifelong friends. Gurney was particularly impressed by Jung's patience and even temper. One day while riding, Thomas attempted to jump a 6-bar gate. On his first attempt, he was thrown from the horse. He tried again and was thrown again. On his third attempt, he cleared it. He believed strongly in the power of perseverance. He believed what one man can do, another can, if he is willing to make the effort. Interrupting an otherwise idyllic stay with Barclay, at 15 he contracted the consumption. He was subjected to some of the practices he would later question as a physician. He was only bled twice and kept on a diet of milk, eggs, broth, and vegetables, quite liberal at the time. The most painful part of his treatment involved a blister his doctors insisted on keeping open on his chest. Although their methods were ineffective, they were not as harmful as many of the popular treatments of the era. His caretakers, Richard Brocklesby, personal doctor of Samuel Johnson and Edmund Burke, and Thomas Dimsdale, the man who inoculated Catherine the Great against smallpox, were quite moderate compared to their contemporaries. Yet his unpleasant brush with death proved to be a blessing in disguise, as it brought him to the attention of his uncle, who wished to guide his gifted nephew through his adolescence. Not that I am of the opinion eating a little fish twice or thrice a week would hurt you, but you must make the trial cautiously and follow which seems on experience not to be prejudicial. Your prudery about abstaining from the use of sugar on account of the slave trade in anyone else would be altogether ridiculous, but as long as the whole of your mind keeps free from spiritual pride or too much presumption in your facility of acquiring language, which is no more than the dross of knowledge, you may be indulged in such whims till your mind becomes enlightened with more reason. Thomas was an abolitionist and abstained from the produce of the slave trade for 7 years. True to his Quaker faith, David Barclay would, at the cost of £3,000 sterling, free 30 slaves in Jamaica. Brocklesby associated with an impressive group of men, including the painter Sir Joshua Reynolds and Edmund Burke, who was receiving acclaim for his reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke was impressed by Jung's translation of a Shakespearean soliloquy into Greek. Speaking for his famous patient, Brocklesby instructs his nephew, now on the precipice of adulthood. Burke advises you to study Aristotle's logic, his poetics, and above all books, Cicero's moral and philosophical works. Your mind is not yet strained to any, and he thinks you should be reared and cultivated in the best manner so as to form your views, to emulate a Bacon or a Newton in the maturity and fullness of time, for he thinks it worthwhile for a comprehensive mind to be disregardful of any pecuniary emoluments of a profession. If you can but be satisfied with a small competence, and feel your mind prone to and satisfied with enlarged and useful speculation. At 17 he had read nearly all of the major writers of antiquity in their original tongues and a considerable number of technical tracts, including Newton's Optics, a work that would later inspire, according to the doctor himself, his most important contribution. While he was a competent experimentalist, who, like Boyle and Hooke, could design apparatuses when needed, he generally preferred to take a theoretical approach to problems. His boyhood included the reading of barometers and the examination of plants, but these trivial pursuits lost their luster as he grew older. He expresses this sentiment in his autobiographical sketch. Not that he was ever particularly fond of repeating experiments, or even of attempting new ones, for he thought the sacrifice of time generally great, and the success very uncertain. Yet he was not a compulsive reader, either. Though he wrote with rapidity, he read but slowly, and perhaps the whole list of the works that he studied in the course of 50 years does not amount to more than 1,000 volumes, while it is said that William King the poet read no fewer than 7,000 in the course of a residence of 7 years at Oxford. William King is unknown today, even by literary scholars. Undoubtedly influenced by his illness and his uncle, Thomas decided to become a physician. He left Barclay's country house for London, where he would study at the Hunterian School of Anatomy. Admiration may have played a part, but Brocklesby offered him part of his estate. This was surely tempting to a young man who had many affluent friends, but was not independently wealthy himself. What drew so many promising pupils to John Hunter's school? Every student was promised his own cadaver. Because this was an era before refrigeration and modern mortuary techniques, the bodies in most seasons did not last long. This meant the school often had to call upon resurrection men to bring them bodies. Entire graveyards were picked clean to keep up with demand. Many a bereaved relative followed an empty coffin in a solemn funeral procession through Georgian London, writes Wendy Moore in her biography about John Hunter. On several occasions, when thefts were suspected, horrified relatives would frantically dig up grave after grave, only to find every body gone. It was in this strange but stimulating environment Jung, while watching the dissection of an ox's eye, became interested in the long-standing question of accommodation. How the eye is able to see objects at different distances, a problem that had been tackled by Descartes and Johannes Kepler. His research on this topic culminated in his first scientific paper of note. He presented it to the Royal Society when he was 20. It is well known that the eye, when not acted upon by any exertion of the mind, conveys a distinct impression of those objects only which are situated at a certain distance from itself, that this distance is different in different persons, and that the eye can, by volition of the mind, be accommodated to view other objects at a much lesser distance, but how this accommodation is effected has long been a matter of dispute, and has not yet been satisfactorily explained. Earlier in the 18th century, George Porterfield noticed cataract patients whose eyes had been couched could not accommodate. However, with glass lenses of different levels of convexity, they were able to see objects at different distances. Yet how the eye performed this feat was still a mystery, one that Jung partially solved. After studying the structures of the eye in detail, he concluded accommodation was caused by the lens itself changing its curvature. This is correct. However, the lens itself is not muscular, as he believed. The lens of the eye changes shape, it was later discovered, due to the ciliary muscles, which, acting like strings, contract to flatten the lens and, when at ease, thicken it, like an adaptable pair of eyeglasses. This paper, Observations on Vision, was delivered to the Royal Society by Brocklesby in 1793. John Hunter claimed he had already made this discovery almost immediately after the presentation. This led to rumors about plagiarism. Perhaps, they speculated, Charles Blagden had blabbed at one of Brocklesby's symposiums. Although damaging to his reputation, Jung's modesty and record of excellence triumphed over the gossip. John Hunter died shortly after making his claim. His student, Everard Home, delivered the lecture in his place. Based on experiments with cataract patients, he claimed the lens was not the sole cause of accommodation. Because Home's name carried such authority, Jung publicly withdrew his hypothesis. In 7 years he would perform his own remarkable series of experiments to prove his point. He left London for Edinburgh, where he would continue his studies. Tuition was inexpensive, the lectures were delivered in the vernacular, and there were no religious restrictions. Both Oxford and Cambridge were closed to Quakers. Wishing to take the scenic route, he resolved to travel by horse. On his way, he met Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles, upon whom he made a favorable impression. Erasmus wrote a letter of introduction for the budding scientist to a friend at Edinburgh. He unites the scholar with the philosopher, and the cultivation of modern arts with the simplicity of ancient manners. Against the injunctions of his Quaker upbringing, Jung took up dancing and the flute. He also attended theatrical performances. As usual, he was meticulous and critical in his approach. Purportedly, his peers found him in his room after his first dance lesson, with a compass tracing the steps. In his spare time, he eagerly devoured Don Quixote, Orlando Furioso, and Samuel Johnson's Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland. Of the eminent Dr. Johnson's work, he wrote, "It exhibits some strength of mental powers, but with a mixture of pedantry, bigotry, and prejudice." On a stout black horse, he set off for Scotland. To lose one's way in a dark night, to have to pass through rocks and bogs, to ford deep waters, to cross steep mountains, to stand long in waiting for an asylum at a late hour in a miserable hut, to be prepared for deranged accoutrements, a lame horse, his shoes loose, his back galled, his spirits flagging, and again after a short time to be welcomed with as much hospitality and entertained with as much splendor as any lord of a castle would receive a knight-errant, to be at ease from every care and in the enjoyment of every amusement that men of sense and women of elegance can afford at these vicissitudes, exercise the same qualities, require the same virtues, and excite the same emotions as the obsolete chivalrous tales of fabulous ages. By Young's own account, he had an immensely good time dancing and conversing with the ladies of Scotland. Biographer Thomas Peacock called him passionately fond of female company. Young preserves his dalliances in his travel log. "I was showing Lady C some of my sketches. She begged to see my notes, and I showed the greatest part of them. All the family are musical. The ladies sing admirably. Cards and the fine piano occupied the evening. After supper, besides other songs, I heard a most beautiful canzonet. It was 12 o'clock when we retired. After breakfast I took my leave, not without regretting that I had so little time to observe the beauties of Rivalry. Lady Charlotte is handsomer than Lady Augusta. She sings better, but she has less good sense, and less sweetness, and innocent giddiness sometimes gives her the appearance of a little affectation. She is to Lady Augusta what Venus is to Minerva. I suppose she wishes for no more. Both are goddesses." Toward the end of his journey, he communicated his newfound love of travel to his mother. "I think I cannot better spend the next 2 years of my life than in attending, at the same time I continue my scientific pursuits, under the most eminent professors in different parts of Europe, to the various forms into which the customs and habits of different countries have molded the human mind, in imitating what is laudable, and in avoiding what is culpable, and in exerting myself to gain the acquaintance and friendship of the virtuous and learned." Unusual for a scientist of his time, and particularly an English one, Jung did not allow nationalism to blind him to the shortcomings of his own country. For this reason he traveled to Göttingen. There he not only became fluent in German, but the value he saw in cross-cultural exchange was strengthened during his stay. Of Germany he says, "Science here has one advantage, that the doctrines of both countries are well known here, while the English attend little to any opinions but those of their own country." His dissertation, composed in Latin and dedicated to his uncle, combined his love for language and anatomy. He constructed an alphabet containing 47 letters meant to encompass all the sounds humans were capable of making. He hoped this would be useful for those recording languages from the oral cultures of Africa and the Americas. After graduating, he took a tour of Germany and Austria, mingling and meeting with some of the continent's finest minds. He had been away from England for nearly 2 years. Due to new legislation mandating 2 full years be spent at the same institution in order to earn a physician's license, Jung returned to school. For a variety of professional reasons, he applied to Cambridge. Although he had been drifting away from the Quaker faith for some time, he had to formally renounce it before being admitted. His renunciation did not excommunicate him from the Quaker Church, however. This would happen later because he had been seen in places of public diversion. He was not happy with this situation, but, in his own words, attempted to make the best of it. Many of the lectures covered material he had already been exposed to. Thus, most of his time was spent in solitary study. His lukewarm attitude toward Cambridge was downplayed by his first 2 biographers, proud alumni themselves, but Thomas took no pains to conceal his disenchantment with the state of England's oldest institutions of learning. The island, he asserted, was 40 years behind the continent. His commitment to objectivity is captured by a short sketch of him written by one of his Cantabrigian peers. He seldom gave an opinion, and never volunteered one. He never laid down the law like other learned doctors, or uttered apothegms, or sayings to be remembered. Indeed, like most mathematicians, though we hear of abstract mathematics, he never seemed to think abstractly. A fact, a difficult calculation, an ingenious instrument, or a new invention would engage his attention, but he never spoke of morals, of metaphysics, or of religion. Of the last I never heard him say a word, nothing in favor of any sect or in opposition of any doctrine. At the same time, no skeptical doubt, no loose assertion, no idle scuff ever escaped him. He was not reclusive by any means, merely anxious to move on with his life and his studies. Shortly after his graduation, Brocklesby passed away, leaving him with a sizable inheritance. The house he promptly sold before returning to London to begin his career. Like most inheritances, his was bittersweet. It could not have come at a more opportune moment, and it could not have happened to a more deserving person, one who was not and perhaps could not be turned idle by money. His new wealth gave him temporary financial security, but it did not diminish his industriousness. Always prudent, he kept his cost of living low and sought employment. He continued to research accommodation, using and sometimes improving on the methods developed by others earlier in the century. He found the near and far points of his own vision. Jung was mildly myopic. His near point was 8 inches, which he initially assumed to be normal. We now know it is 10. Yet he was not oblivious to this for long. In his sketch, he mentions how this short-sightedness affected his ability to properly read the reactions of others. The believability of plays of mistaken identity was undoubtedly greater then than now. Jung outlined 4 possible explanations for accommodation. Indifferent to the success or failure of his own speculations, he put each one to the test. Through a series of brilliant experiments, some of which he performed on himself, he weeded out opposing hypotheses. In 1793 he believed the lens itself was muscular. Now he was not so sure. In his paper on the mechanism of the eye, he wisely stayed quiet about the way in which the eye's curvature changes. He delivered on the theory of light and colors to the Royal Society a year later. Whereas his last paper had depended upon painstaking and sometimes dangerous experiments, this paper was largely speculative. Jung found the current explanations of color vision convoluted, and proposed a more parsimonious solution to replace them. Now, as it is almost impossible to conceive each sensitive point of the retina to contain an infinite number of particles, each capable of vibrating in perfect unison with every possible undulation, it becomes necessary to suppose the number is limited. It was known then light existed on a spectrum. Newton's prism proved it beyond a doubt, yet it seemed unlikely the human eye had receptors for each and every possible color. Breaking from this clunky orthodoxy, which made the implicit assumption that humans had been designed to perfectly perceive their environments, Jung postulated different colors stimulate different combinations of receptors, which the brain then interprets. Green, an intermediate wavelength, stimulates both yellow and blue, for example. Jung's retinal mosaic, though given empirical substance by Helmholtz, was not definitively proven until 1959. John Dalton was also interested in color vision, but for much more personal reasons. Red-green color blindness to this day is occasionally called Daltonism in his honor. He describes his affliction thus: "That part of the image which others call red appears to me little more than a shade or defect of light. After that the orange, yellow, and green seem one color, which descends pretty uniformly from an intense to a rare yellow, making what I should call different shades of yellow." Dalton attributed his color blindness to a discoloration of his aqueous humor, which seemed less far-fetched than Thomas's proposition. Rods and cones had not yet been discovered. The brain as a processing center of information was not an unexplored topic. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason was published over 20 years before. It was not translated into English until 1839, but its ideas had reached the island whose intellectual insularity Thomas lamented. There is no evidence the book affected him, or that he even read it, but the notions of innate categories of perception was very much in the air. Dalton's eyes, which have been preserved for posterity, were later examined by experts. He was no exception. His was caused by faulty photoreceptors. Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell, reflecting on the trichromatic theory later in the 19th century, writes, "Thomas Young was the first who, starting from the well-known fact that there are three primary colors, sought for the explanation of this fact, not in the nature of light, but in the constitution of man." In spite of his learning, Young was not noted for his presentations. Compared to his contemporary Sir Humphrey Davy, who was, in the words of a director of the Royal Society, a narcoleptically boring speaker. In 1802, Young began one of his presentations with an eloquent introduction, one which surely inspired his audience, even if his delivery was dry. Those who possess the genuine spirit of scientific investigation, and who have tasted the pure satisfaction arising from an advancement in intellectual acquirements, are contented to proceed in their researches without inquiring at every step what they gain by their newly discovered lights, and to what practical purposes they are applicable. They receive a sufficient gratification from the enlargement of their views of the constitution of the universe, and experience, in the immediate pursuit of knowledge, that pleasure which others wish to obtain more circuitously by its means. And it is one of the principal advantages of a liberal education that it creates a susceptibility of an employment. And it is one of the principal advantages of a liberal education that it creates a susceptibility of an enjoyment so elegant and so rational. Here it could be argued he was merely echoing the ideals of the Enlightenment. However, Young, as attested by friends and acquaintances, did not possess mystical or philosophical inclinations. He was speaking as a practical man free from the fetters of agendas and ideologies. His focus turned midway in the year from ophthalmology to optics. Newton envisioned light as a stream composed of many tiny particles. Huygens believed it was a wave that traveled through an invisible medium called ether. This is not as odd as it sounds. It was known then that light could travel through a vacuum, while the other waves known, like sound, needed a medium. The particle theory, though more succinct, had a flaw. As Huygens noticed, when light hits the boundary between two media, like air and water, part of the light is transmitted and refracts, while part of it is reflected. It is hard to say whether Young imbibed the Enlightenment modus opere aude, or merely embodied it. His questioning of Newton was construed as heresy. As a phenomenon, he commanded respect, but even a phenomenon could not question a god. He swiftly responded to his charges. But much as I venerate the name of Newton, I am not therefore obliged to believe that he was infallible. I see not with exultation, but with regret, that he was liable to err, and that his authority has, perhaps, sometimes even retarded the progress of science. Another issue with Isaac Newton's corpuscles was interference, defined as the process in which two or more light, sound, or electromagnetic waves of the same frequency combine to reinforce or cancel each other. The amplitude of the resulting wave being equal to the sum of the amplitudes of the combining waves. If light was a particle, we would expect the presence of two slits to have no bearing on the result. The results would be identical, only doubled. Here Jung showed constructive and destructive interference took place. Young's modulus, an equation with applications in a huge variety of fields, is a measure to predict the compression or elongation of material based on its elasticity or rigidity. This is obviously very useful to engineers. Differences in substance led him to contemplate one of the oldest problems in history, the fundamental composition of matter. Along with Dalton, Jung was one of the physicists who championed the atomic theory. Although its foundations were laid in the 19th century, it was not universally accepted. Ever parsimonious and always swimming against the stream, he did not believe heat was an invisible substance existing in its own right, but a consequence of molecular motion. Whereas physics had made great strides since Aristotle, medicine had advanced little since Hippocrates and Galen. Within his two books on medicine, one a general text, the other on consumptive disorders, Jung questioned the established wisdom as well as the innumerable quack remedies being peddled in England and America. Medicine at the time was not systematic. Doctors relied largely on anecdotes and the accepted wisdom of the ancients. His texts were perceived as too impersonal, a quality patients and, sadly, his colleagues did not find endearing. Joseph Pettigrew, in his series of biographies of eminent physicians, summarizes, "He was perhaps too deeply informed and therefore too sensible of the difficulty of arriving at true knowledge in the profession of medicine, hastily to form a judgment, and his great love of and adherence to truth made him often hesitant where others felt no difficulty whatever in the expression of their opinion." Jung himself channeled his frustration with his profession into a poem. "Medical men, my mood mistaking, most mawkish, monstrous messes making, molest me much more manfully, my mind might meet my malady, medicine's mere mockery murders me." Doctors of the time did not want to admit their field was still in its infancy. Thomas Peacock, a medical man himself, had great sympathy for Jung's frustrations. It is the peculiar misfortune of the medical profession that its members can rarely dare to confess their ignorance, thinking it more or less necessary, in order to maintain their influence with their patients and with the world, to speak with equal decision, whether they are authorized by their knowledge to do so or not. Jung began deciphering the Rosetta Stone in 1814. He was 41. Although others assumed the hieroglyphics were pictograms, Jung thought perhaps they represented words or phonemes. The Rosetta Stone contained inscriptions in hieroglyphics, Demotic, and in Greek. Until Champollion's arrival in 1819, Jung was one of the few linguists working on the Egyptian language. In contrast to his rival, Champollion was monomaniacal, excitable, and political, at one point even leading an insurrection against the French king in Grenoble. Whereas Champollion visited Egypt and had a deep interest in its history and culture, Jung viewed Decipherment as a puzzle. Of course, he already had many accomplishments, whereas his competitor did not. The failure to add another to his list would not destroy his reputation as a scholar. He was fully aware of how much more it meant to Champollion than to him. The further Champollion advances by the exertion of his own talents and ingenuity, the more easy it will be for him to admit, without any exorbitant sacrifice of his fame, the claim that I have advanced to a priority with respect to the first elements of all of his researches, and I cannot help thinking that he will ultimately feel it most for his own substantial honor and reputation, to be more anxious to admit the just claims of others than they be to advance them. The Anglo-French rivalry, which had reached a feverish pitch during the Napoleonic Wars, stoked the debate. The English said their man took the first steps and laid the foundation. The French retorted that not all of Jung's assertions were correct. The Egyptologist John Ray succinctly summarizes the affair. Jung was the first person since the end of the Roman Empire to be able to read a demotic text, and in spite of a proportion of incorrect guesses, he surely deserves to be known as the decipherer of demotic. It is no disservice to Champollion to allow him this distinction. Eventually the two men met in Paris. Jung writes to Gurney, "He has shown me far more attention than I have ever showed or could show to any living being. He devoted 7 whole hours at once to looking over with me his papers in the magnificent collection which is committed to his care." Fortunately, there is no evidence Eliza ever saw this letter. The stereotype of the detached intellectual is a common one, but it is an ideal few live up to and even fewer manage to maintain in their personal lives. Equanimity was a lifelong trait for Thomas. Although not without social grace and emotional intelligence, he was normally more engaged with his own pursuits. Pattern recognition and symbolic manipulation are common measures of intelligence. It was these talents, as well as his familiarity with many other scripts, which enabled him to see the similarities between the demotic and hieroglyphic scripts. He realized one was merely a variation of the other. The abundance of his knowledge and the number of fields over which it was spread, coupled with the number of symbolic systems with which he was familiar, made him an ideal code cracker. He was also a fine general linguist. Though he was not the first to recognize the relationship between Sanskrit and other European languages, he coined the term Indo-European to describe this family. During the later half of his life, he made a minor contribution to insurance and consulted for the British Navy regarding a new way to construct ships. Although he had no family history of heart disease or any of the habits that typically contribute to its development, he passed away at age 56 due to excessive ossification of his aorta. His name is in hundreds of textbooks, and he is known, in name alone, to students from a variety of fields. Yet the man himself, never one to lust after fame, would likely be content with this state of affairs. He and his achievements are known to the few who share his sense of wonder and his passion for learning. Let us hear the man speak for himself, and for all who love knowledge for its own sake. His own idea was that the faculties are more exercised, and therefore probably more fortified, by going a little beyond the rudiments only, and overcoming the great elementary difficulties of a variety of studies, than by spending the same number of hours in any one pursuit. It was generally more his object to cultivate his own mind than to acquire knowledge for others in departments which were not his immediate concern. While he thought with regard to the modern doctrines of the division of labor that they applied much less to mind than to matter, and that while they increased the produce of a workman's physical strength, they tended to reduce his dignity in the scale of existence from a reasoning being to a mere machine.